In 1980, a Nigerian pastor named David Oyedepo claimed God spoke to him during a marathon prayer session. The message was simple but world-changing: liberation of the human race from poverty. Within 4 decades, that single vision would transform into a $4 billion empire, a personal fleet of private jets, and a university that charges some of the highest tuition fees on the African continent. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. David Oyedepo didn't invent this theology, he imported it, and the source might surprise you. Rewind to Depression-era America, 1930s Oklahoma, where a stuttering young preacher named Oral Roberts is about to have an experience that will reshape Christianity itself. Roberts claimed God healed him of tuberculosis and a severe stutter during a tent revival. Whether you believe that or not, what happened next is documented historical fact. Roberts began preaching a revolutionary idea that would have made medieval Christians burn him at the stake. He told impoverished Dust Bowl farmers that God wanted them rich. Not spiritually rich, not heavenly reward rich. Cash rich, car rich, house rich. This was theological dynamite. For nearly 2,000 years, Christianity had largely preached the virtue of poverty. Jesus himself had said it was easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. Monks took vows of poverty. Saints gave away their possessions. The prosperity gospel flipped this entire tradition on its head with a single seductive promise: your bank account is a direct measure of God's favor. But Oral Roberts wasn't working alone in developing this theology. A businessman turned preacher named E.W. Kenyon had been quietly laying the theological groundwork for decades. Kenyon blended Christianity with something unexpected: the New Thought movement, a metaphysical philosophy that taught the power of positive thinking to shape physical reality. Kenyon's innovation was remarkably simple. He took the power of positive confession from New Thought and dressed it in Christian language. Speak wealth, and wealth appears. Declare healing, and healing manifests. Your words literally create your reality because you are made in the image of a creator God. Kenneth Hagin, a Texas preacher born in 1917, took Kenyon's ideas and systematized them into what he called the Word of Faith movement. Hagin claimed Jesus himself appeared to him 8 times with divine revelations. He taught that faith was a force, words were containers of power, and believers could write their own tickets with God. His Rhema Bible Training Center in Tulsa, Oklahoma, became the Harvard of prosperity theology, graduating thousands of preachers who would spread this message worldwide. Now, here's where the story takes its first dramatic turn. The prosperity gospel might have remained a peculiar American phenomenon, confined to tent revivals and Sunday morning television, if not for one technological revolution and one geopolitical shift. The technology was satellite television. The geopolitical shift was decolonization. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, American televangelists like Oral Roberts, Kenneth Copeland, and Jim Bakker were beaming their prosperity messages directly into living rooms across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. But they weren't just exporting a message. They were exporting an aesthetic. The massive auditoriums, the expensive suits, the tears of joy, the testimonies of miraculous financial breakthroughs. For viewers in newly independent nations still struggling with the economic legacies of colonialism, these broadcasts presented something intoxicating: a Christianity that promised not just heaven after death, but Mercedes-Benzes in the present. The timing was devastatingly effective. Consider Africa in the 1980s. Structural adjustment programs imposed by the International Monetary Fund were gutting social services. Traditional economies were collapsing. Unemployment was soaring. Colonial borders had grouped rival ethnic groups into unstable nations. Into this chaos came the prosperity gospel with a message perfectly calibrated for the desperate. Your poverty is not the result of historical exploitation or economic systems beyond your control. Your poverty is a spiritual problem with a spiritual solution. Give to God through His anointed servants, speak words of faith, and watch your circumstances transform. By 1990, prosperity theology had established beachheads on every continent. But it wasn't simply American Christianity being exported. Local leaders were adapting the message, making it their own, often amplifying its most extreme elements. Welcome back to Professor Archive, and before I continue dropping more fascinating details, let me know in the comments where you're watching from right now and what time it is where you are. I'm genuinely curious about the global community we're building here. And if this content has ever expanded your mind or made you think differently about history, consider dropping a super thanks. It helps keep deep dive content like this coming. Now back to our story. In South Korea, David Yonggi Cho built Yoido Full Gospel Church into the largest Christian congregation in world history, with over 800,000 members at its peak. Cho preached what he called the threefold blessing: spiritual salvation, physical health, and material prosperity. In 2014, at age 78, Cho was convicted of embezzling $12 million from his church to benefit his son's business ventures. He received a suspended sentence. In Brazil, Eder Macedo founded the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God in a former funeral parlor in Rio de Janeiro in 1977. Today, his church claims over 8 million members worldwide and owns TV Record, the second largest television network in Brazil. Macedo's personal net worth is estimated at over $1 billion. His theology is particularly aggressive, promising financial returns within specific timeframes for donations. He calls it the challenge of faith. Give what you cannot afford, and God will multiply it back to you. In 2009, prosecutors charged Macedo with money laundering and fraud, though the case was eventually dismissed. The numbers tell a staggering story. In 1970, there were approximately 63 million Pentecostals and Charismatics in the Global South. By 2020, that number had exploded to over 600 million. While not all of these believers adhere to prosperity theology, scholars estimate that the majority of charismatic churches in Africa, Latin America, and Asia incorporate significant prosperity teaching into their messages. But here's what the televangelists and megachurch pastors don't advertise. In 2016, economist Jonathan Gruber and journalist John Schmidt published research examining the economic impact of prosperity gospel churches in Brazil. Their findings were sobering. Families that tithed to prosperity churches saw no improvement in their economic circumstances compared to non-tithing families. In fact, the most aggressive givers often experienced greater financial hardship. The wealth wasn't being created. It was being transferred from the poorest congregants upward to church leadership. A 2019 study by researchers at the University of Pretoria examined prosperity gospel adherents in South Africa. They found that believers often went into debt to maintain their tithing commitments, prioritizing church giving over food, medicine, and children's education. The psychological mechanism was particularly cruel. When promised prosperity didn't materialize, believers blamed themselves for insufficient faith, leading to increased giving in hopes of a breakthrough. Now, let's pause here, because I want to be fair. Critics of the prosperity gospel often paint its adherents as naive victims of obvious manipulation. This is condescending and ignores a crucial truth. The prosperity gospel offers something that traditional Christianity often failed to provide: a theology of aspiration. For centuries, Christian missionaries told colonized peoples to accept their suffering as God's will, to store up treasures in heaven rather than seek them on earth. This theology, whatever its spiritual merits, was remarkably convenient for colonial powers who were busy extracting wealth from these same populations. The prosperity gospel, for all its problems, represents a rejection of this narrative. It tells the marginalized that they deserve abundance, that God wants them to thrive, that poverty is not their destiny. The appeal is not stupidity. The appeal is hope. This is why prosperity theology has proven so resistant to criticism. When scholars or journalists or traditional clergy point out the obvious financial interests of prosperity preachers, believers often respond with suspicion. They have learned correctly to distrust institutions that benefit from their disempowerment. The tragedy is that they have placed their trust in a different set of institutions that benefit from their disempowerment in different ways. Let me tell you about a woman named Ukamaka, and I'm using a pseudonym to protect her privacy. In 2015, she was a domestic worker in Lagos, Nigeria, earning about 50,000 naira per month, roughly $100 at the time. She was a devoted member of a prosperity gospel church and believed deeply in the principle of seed faith. Every month, she gave 30% of her income to the church, often going without meals to make the donation. Ukamaka was promised a breakthrough. Specifically, her pastor told her that 2016 would be her year of open doors, her year of supernatural financial elevation. She believed this completely and even borrowed money to increase her seed giving at the end of 2015, hoping to maximize her coming blessing. When 2016 arrived with continued poverty, Ukamaka didn't blame her pastor or question the theology. She blamed herself. She hadn't had enough faith. She hadn't given with a pure heart. She redoubled her efforts. By 2018, Ukamaka had accumulated debts equal to 6 months of her salary. Her health had declined from malnutrition. She had pulled her eldest daughter from school because she couldn't afford the fees, and she was still giving 30% of her income to the church, still waiting for her breakthrough for her. Ukamaka's story is not unusual. It is typical. Researchers estimate that millions of believers across the global south are caught in similar cycles of giving, disappointment, self-blame, and increased giving. But here's where our story takes perhaps its most troubling turn. The prosperity gospel hasn't just captured churches, it has begun reshaping government policy. In Brazil, the Evangelical Caucus in Congress, heavily influenced by prosperity theology, has grown from 0 seats in 1986 to over 90 seats today. These legislators have successfully blocked land reform, environmental protections, and wealth redistribution programs, arguing that poverty is a spiritual problem requiring spiritual solutions rather than systemic change. In Nigeria, prosperity gospel leaders have become power brokers in national elections. Presidents seek their endorsements. Their churches have become voting blocs, and the policy implications are significant. When the theological position is that poverty results from insufficient faith rather than economic injustice, there is little motivation to address the structural causes of inequality. In the United States, prosperity gospel adherents were among Donald Trump's most reliable supporters in 2016 and 2020. Paula White, a prosperity preacher, served as Trump's personal pastor and held an official position in the White House Faith Office. Televangelists like Kenneth Copeland and Creflo Dollar celebrated Trump as God's chosen businessman, a living testament to the prosperity message. The political implications extend even further. Prosperity theology inherently validates existing wealth as divine approval. This makes it resistant to any critique of economic systems. If billionaires are billionaires because God blessed them, then questioning the systems that create billionaires becomes questioning God's will. The prosperity gospel, despite its origins among marginalized believers seeking hope, has become a powerful tool for justifying inequality. Let's talk about the private jets. In 2015, Creflo Dollar, whose surname could not be more symbolic if he had chosen it himself, asked his congregation to help him purchase a $65 million Gulfstream G650. The previous church jet, he explained, had experienced mechanical problems. The response from the secular media was mockery. But Dollar's congregation began donating, and while the specific fundraising goal wasn't met, Dollar got his jet anyway through undisclosed means. Kenneth Copeland, whose net worth exceeds $300 million, owns multiple jets and has defended them in spectacularly viral fashion. In a 2019 interview, when asked why he didn't fly commercial, Copeland called commercial airlines a long tube with a bunch of demons. He needs private jets, he explained, to pray in peace and hear from God without interruption. Jesse Duplantis asked his followers in 2018 to fund a $54 million Dassault Falcon 7X. He already owned 3 other jets, but explained that Jesus himself had instructed him to believe for a Falcon 7X. Now, you might think this level of excess would alienate believers. Quite the opposite. In prosperity theology, the wealth of pastors serves as evidence that the system works. If Kenneth Copeland is rich, then his teachings must be true. His jets are not hypocrisy. They are testimony. They are proof of concept. This creates a self-reinforcing psychological loop. Believers give money to wealthy pastors become wealthier. The increased wealth proves the message is true, therefore believers should give more money. The pastor's prosperity becomes the congregation's vicarious success. The theological machinery behind this is genuinely sophisticated. Prosperity teachers have developed interpretations of biblical texts that seem, on surface reading, to support their message. Malachi 3:10, where God promises to open the windows of heaven for those who tithe, becomes a divine investment guarantee. 3 John 1-2, where the author wishes that the reader would prosper and be in health, becomes a universal promise of wealth to all believers. Mark 10:29-30, where Jesus promises a hundredfold return to those who give up possessions for the gospel, becomes a literal financial multiplication table. Professional biblical scholars, both conservative and liberal, largely agree that these interpretations strip passages from their historical context and misread their original intent. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Academic biblical scholarship has virtually no influence on how most Christians actually read the Bible. Prosperity preachers, with their massive media platforms and entertaining presentation styles, reach audiences that scholarly publications never will. By 2023, the prosperity gospel had effectively become the dominant form of Christianity in much of the global South. In Nigeria, scholars estimate that over 70% of Christian churches incorporate some form of prosperity teaching. In Brazil, the figure is similar. In Guatemala, prosperity Pentecostalism has grown so rapidly that the country may become majority Protestant within a generation, a stunning shift in a historically Catholic nation. The global headquarters of Christianity has shifted. In 1900, over 80% of Christians lived in Europe and North America. By 2025, that figure will be below 40%. The future of Christianity is African, Asian, and Latin American, and that future is being shaped significantly by prosperity theology. But resistance is growing. In South Africa, the Commission for the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Cultural, Religious, and Linguistic Communities launched an investigation into abusive practices in prosperity gospel churches. They documented pastors feeding congregants grass, spraying them with insecticide, and charging for miracle water, all while accumulating vast personal wealth. In Nigeria, a new generation of Christian leaders has begun publicly criticizing prosperity teaching. Pastor Tunde Bakare, once associated with the prosperity movement himself, has become an outspoken critic, calling the theology a scam perpetrated against the poor. Academic institutions in Africa and Latin America have begun producing critical scholarship on prosperity theology, examining its historical roots and contemporary impacts with rigor that challenges its claims. Perhaps most significantly, some former prosperity adherents have begun sharing their stories publicly. Like Ukamaka, many spent years blaming themselves before recognizing the systemic nature of their exploitation. Their testimonies, shared on social media and in documentary films, are reaching audiences that academic critiques never could. What do we make of all this? I think the prosperity gospel reveals something important about how belief systems spread. They don't succeed simply because they're true or false. They succeed because they meet psychological needs, because they arrive at the right historical moment, because they leverage technology effectively, and because they offer something people desperately want. The prosperity gospel succeeded because it offered hope to the hopeless. It provided an explanation for suffering that made the sufferer the hero of their own story. It created communities of aspiration in places where aspiration had been systematically crushed. It took a Christianity that had often been used to justify colonial extraction and repurposed it to promise abundance to the extracted. That this hope was largely false, that the abundance flowed primarily to leaders while congregants remained poor, does not make the hope less real or the need it filled less genuine. The question going forward is whether alternatives can emerge that meet the same psychological and social needs without the exploitation. Can Christianity in the global South develop theologies of hope and aspiration that don't funnel resources from the poor to wealthy pastors? Can communities of mutual support form that actually improve members' economic circumstances? Can the energy and creativity of Pentecostal worship be preserved while its most extractive elements are rejected? These are not questions with easy answers. The prosperity gospel didn't hijack Christianity through violence or state power. It won converts through persuasion, through media, through meeting people where they were. Any alternative will have to win converts the same way. I want to leave you with one final story. In 2019, I came across an interview with a former prosperity gospel pastor from Ghana who had left the movement after 2 decades. He described the exact moment his faith in the theology broke. A woman in his congregation had given her last 200 cedis, about $40, as seed faith. She was a widow with 3 children and had been told this sacrifice would trigger a breakthrough. The breakthrough never came. Instead, she was evicted from her home for failure to pay rent. Her children went hungry, and she came back to the church, not angry, but apologizing. She apologized to the pastor for her insufficient faith. She asked what she had done wrong. She wanted to know how to fix her spiritual deficit so the prosperity would finally flow. The pastor looked at this woman, starving, homeless, still believing, still blaming herself, and something inside him shattered. He realized he had been taking money from the desperate and giving them nothing but guilt in return. He left the ministry within 6 months. But here's what haunts me about his story. When he left, his congregation didn't follow. They found another prosperity pastor. They continued giving. They continued waiting for their breakthrough. The woman who apologized for her insufficient faith? As far as he knows, she's still a member of a prosperity gospel church, still giving, still waiting, still hoping. That hope is not a character flaw. It is not stupidity. It is the most human thing in the world. And understanding how that hope has been systematically exploited is not about judging believers. It is about demanding better for them. This has been a Professor Archive. If this changed how you think about religion, economics, or history, that subscribe button is right there. The bell icon keeps you from missing deep dives like this one. And those super thanks donations? They tell me what topics you want more of. What's your profession, by the way? Drop it in the comments. I'm curious whether we have any economists, pastors, or former prosperity church members watching. Your perspectives make this community richer. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember that the most important histories are often the ones happening right now, in living rooms and sanctuaries and hearts around the world.